This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Barda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough.
Our guest today is Professor of Law and Geography and Environmental Studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She has written and edited several books, most recently Settling Nature, The Conservation Regime in Palestine, Israel, that has just been published by the University of Minnesota Press. Professor Iris Braverman, hello and welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
So your book deals with the intersection between nature and politics. And to this effect, you develop the concept of settler ecologies. Maybe explaining what that means exactly would be a good place to start.
Oh, wow. You're starting in the heart of the book. So settler ecologies is a term that I coined in order to kind of make clear the connection between the settler state and the ecological aspects through which power manifests, specifically in Palestine, Israel, but actually I think the concept applies much more broadly than here. And so various aspects of ecologies I find to be settler colonial. For example, this idea that when you reach a place and it's empty, and or terra nullius in kind of the Australian and maybe U.S. context, and this idea that the settler is going to improve it, is going to settle it, is going to fill it up with animals again, as it should be, as nature should be. So several themes and ideas kind of cut across these different settler ecological contexts, and I coined the term settler ecologies to highlight that there are certain aspects of ecological thought that are colonial at heart. So terra nullius is one example. Ecological exceptionalism, this idea that we do ecologies best and this is the only way to do it, or this sometimes Western scientific mode of telling the native or the indigenous person how to do ecologies properly, or that they're doing it in a way that undermines nature, that harms nature. So these are some aspects that I identify as a thread throughout kind of the observations that I've done since I was born here, but most recently in the last 15 years, kind of with interviews, ethnographic work with Israeli nature officials and other Israeli environmentalists, but mainly nature officials, to look at that kind of environmental thought. And not all of it is settler colonial, but I'm identifying in the book focuses on those aspects of ecology. So kind of how nature is utilized in order to promote certain aspects that are settler colonial, and the two central aspects are settling the space and time, on the one hand, and also on the other hand, dispossessing of the indigenous and the local.
But on the face of it, nature conservation, or maybe just an ecological logic, runs counter to this settler instinct of cultivating and domesticating the wilderness, right? Making it, more human rather than natural.
Right. That's exactly the face of it. Right. But it is true that the Zionist discourse does have that inner contradiction of paving with concrete and then at the same time, the one hand paves, the other hand cries or saves, and so I identify that that tension of development, but then at the same time protection. And Israel is really leading in many ways conservation projects. So I identify projects where animals are reintroduced into the wild, animals that have been extirpated, i.e., they have disappeared from this landscape for about 100, 150 years, and then the Israeli conservationists are able, despite all of the difficulties, to bring them back. And these are sites that I've been working with conservationists all over the world, and not just in Israel. And people give them as examples. Oh, look, this was done there. Whereas here, a lot of the time, it was done with the initial intent of resettling the landscape with biblical species. In the larger global conservation community, it is seen as a really sometimes very successful conservation project. So yes, there is the element of development, but Israeli conservationists are actually trying to fight that element. And this idea of Israel as a central place for nature protection is also very strong, and something that I don't think we've wrestled with enough. So 530 nature reserves and national parks, 530. That's like a huge amount in comparison to, say, the United States, where there's 422.
And the United States is slightly bigger than Israel.
Slightly bigger. Yeah. Like Israel is about the size of New Jersey. So, of course, the nature reserves and parks might be somewhat smaller as well than Yosemite and Grand Canyon. But the number says something. And Israel does pride itself for its strong protection, strong laws of wild animal protection, the Protection Act from 1955, very strong in those days. And so, yes, there are those two elements, both the development on the one hand by the Zionist discourse and the protection at the same time that started in the 1950s with the Samech Yizhar and kind of the Zionist movement kind of starting to wake up to the devastation.
Samech Yizhar, the writer.
Samech Yizhar, the poet, the writer, the Chaver Knesset, the Knesset member, right.
Who was a leading conservationist at the time.
Conservationist, right. And the environmental movement started in Achula, which was dried up in order to supposedly create exactly this production for agriculture, for malaria, for different reasons. That's where the birth of resistance by the Israeli environmentalists, the birth of Chevra L'Haganat Hatav, SPNI, the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel.
So what can you tell us really about the evolution of that ethos from the early days of Zionism, the pre-state or under the British mandate and even before, into the beginning of the state years when, Zionism was actually enshrined into law and policy, and later in 1967 and onwards, having to manage the occupation and the enlargement of the borders of Israel and the management of the new population under a different regime.
That's really interesting. You're kind of how you put it this way. So I will say this book is not necessarily a environmental history. It's more a political ecology, a contemporary political ecology. So I do want to highlight that. Whereas, yes, there is some discussion. Clearly, when we speak about colonialism, it doesn't start with Zionism. There's the British gave the Zionists great insights into how to create forests and how to create national parks, and a lot of Israeli laws just basically adopted the British colonial ones. But that's not the focus, really, of my book. So I guess it will require me to kind of, yes, clearly Israeli environmentalism and the settler ecologies themselves have changed through the years. But I am kind of taking a shot of what's going on with 530 nature reserves and national parks, which are about 25% of the land. So it's a quarter.
So that's within the borders of 48?
That's a question that I can't answer you. So that's exactly why I've been a bit ambiguous about that. I think it probably is. It's been very difficult to nail down the exact boundaries. And I think the ambiguity, and I speak about it because it's been very difficult to find maps, to find exactly where the boundaries of what counts and what doesn't count when they count nature reserves. And I think there's a reason why it's ambiguous and ambivalent. So it's this very intentional ambiguity that allows stronger control in various ways. But I will say that the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, which is the central agency that I have been working with and interviewing, and I've been involved with them for a few decades since I was myself an environmental lawyer in Adam Teva V'Din. So I was a lawyer then, and maybe I'll just say like anecdotally that that's where a lot of the connections did start with the Israel Nature Protection Authority and Parks Authority, because I was working then on a petition against the Jewish National Fund and their practices of afforestation, and the people who initiated the petition were the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, who came to us and with whom I worked in order to kind of carve out this petition. So since then, I've been in touch with this authority, and over the years have developed many relationships. And so this has made life somewhat easier in terms of access, because a lot of these people, I worked side by side with them as a lawyer, but even before that as a conservationist myself. So I know some of the people involved. It's a small place. But then on the other hand, as an outsider ethnographer, it's been kind of difficult emotionally to sometimes perhaps impose certain concepts such as settler colonialism that feel alien to them. So whereas they might agree that some of these elements that I'm identifying are problematic, say, in the occupied territories, a lot of them might not see how they're also happening within Israel of 1948 borders, the Israel within the Green Line. And so yeah.
What you're saying is, I'm just going to jump into that.
Sure.
What you're saying is, so your interlocutors, the people that you interviewed, they do their work in conservation, in relation to protection of the environment and the non-human and all this, but they don't have an awareness that part of their mission is actually the settlement project where there's more land that is accessible to Jews and less land accessible to Palestinians.
They might recognize it here and there, but not as a structural project. And maybe because a lot of them are themselves leftists and against the occupation and good people and good conservationists. And this is their life project. For them, protecting a griffon vulture is what they're focused on. And they don't see it as a political project. In fact, they see it as removed from politics as anything could be. Like all that interests them, and I've heard this again and again, nature is my only flag. I have no politics. Nature crosses boundaries, So this is the discourse. When you start breaking it down and you start asking which animal and why this animal and how is this interpreted by others here, your ability to suddenly follow the griffon vulture into, say, Saudi Arabia or intervene in Jordanian administration in order to rescue this. So where do you get that kind of authority and that kind of legitimacy? And how do you feel so entitled to do that? When you start asking those questions is when you start kind of scratching the surface of, for many of them, it's really not about politics. And the fact that those are biblical animals, a lot of them could care less. Yes, there was this initial idea of Ram Yoffe, who was a general, a military general, and he was the first head of the Israel Nature and Parks Authority for many years, actually. And he had this vision. He was also a hunter, so he had this love of large mammals, and he wanted to reintroduce them into the landscape. They weren't here, and so the land of milk and honey. Yet again, this idea of terra nullius, or here what I call animal nullius. It's like, it's emptied of not just humans, but not just humans that count, also animals that count. So we have to resettle the landscape, not only with the animals on 2, but also on animals on 4. So this kind of aliyah, this kind of resettlement of the landscape with animals that are imagined to be the animals that roamed around this area in biblical times. So this is one element that I call the element of biopolitics, this making live. So I'm kind of drawing on Foucauldian, Michel Foucault, and the idea of biopolitics. This making live also comes together with necropolitics, with kind of making die, of killing, literally killing other animals that don't count or are problem animals or affiliated with certain communities. And so I show how the landscape becomes this war zone between animals that are affiliated with the Zionist project and animals that are maybe more problematic and could be affiliated with the Palestinians, such as, say, the Wild S versus. But just give me 1 second. That's one element. I just want to highlight that there's the other technology or technique or strategy, and that is the territorial strategy of takeover of land. The book really alternates between one chapter on land and territory and the more sovereign power, like something we're more accustomed to when we speak about Palestine, Israel, right? Like, okay, so we're fighting over land here, and the other one is kind of the fight over imaginary identity through animals and plants that.
So I want to actually it segues nicely into my next question, which is I like to ask you conceptually what you think is the link between environment and justice, and also in this respect, what do you think would be a way to undo the injustice that you've just described? I mean, in terms of like nature and conservation and reserve. It wouldn't be the opposite of conservation, right? It would be something else.
Right. Yeah, and so here I'm not alone. So luckily there's starting some literature about community conservation. There are ideas of conservation, convivial conservation. There's various ways of thinking around the world of how conservation can overcome its colonial legacies, and come to work a little differently so that it doesn't alienate the local communities. Rather, it works together with those in order to say what I call unsettle nature, right? So it is true that I should have some algorithm here to tell you how to do it. I don't really, unfortunately, because my book, what it does is uncover what I feel like is really hidden to the eyes of a lot of people, and that is that there is an ecological warfare here, that nature is recruited, and that it's very political and it serves political purposes, and my book tries to show the state's use, mainly the state's use, structural use of nature for the project of dispossessing Palestinians and settling with Jews. So that's the project. Now, once we see that, I think that's going to be the first step, the recognition that this is what's going on. I don't believe we're there. I feel like, and that's the importance of the book in this context, that there's almost a shock, like from people who I've worked with, my interlocutors, like they really don't they don't feel like it feels alien to them. It's a completely different perspective that a lot of them have not considered in this context. They'll be really comfortable telling me, well, this is what was done in South Africa and we were there and that was horrible, and but to then come and see how it's used here, they may be able to see it here and there. So the book really tries to, sometimes provocatively, put a mirror to show those aspects, those settler ecologies. And what comes after? Well, number one is this transparency. If this is the project, then okay, how do we move from there? And I do place some hints in the book about maybe stories, because the book is really kind of weaving together of stories, the chapters themselves, the introduction.
I just want to ask you about the chapters because they're so fascinating and eye-opening, and also how they kind of gradually show us different aspects that you really have never thought, you never think about it in this way. And I think even people that are in this field have not looked at it. The way it leads us to think differently about the space and our experience in it, even for childhood experiences of walking in nature, being in nature, relationship to nature, and also the national project. It's kind of, I think, for Israeli Jews, it's a very new way to see, but possibly also for Palestinians, I think. But I was especially intrigued by two chapters. One is called Reintroducing Nature. And you spoke a little bit about those biblical animals, if you could tell us a little bit more about that. And the second one is Juxtaposing Nature. And so each chapter is kind of investigating a different technique of the state, and also a different relationship between the politics and nature. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so like I said, as an ethnographer, as somebody who I feel like it's almost, you can't invent these stories. It would be it's almost too good to be true. Some of these stories are just crazy. So, I don't know. I think the book, if I remember correctly, starts with chapter 2 of the book. The book starts really with the territory. It was a big debate for me where to start, because the animals clearly are just so much more charismatic than speaking of land again. And then with land, it was also a debate, because it was okay, the structure is much more apparent in the occupied territories, and Wadi Kana was I had a huge debate of the 530 which ones to focus on, and I worked through so many of them, so it was so hard to pick 3, and I eventually picked 3, but then I started it with the occupied territories. That was the first draft of the book, and I decided that that defeats my purpose, and so I turn it around and start with the Meron Nature Reserve. That's the first nature reserve that was designated in 1964 by the then new Israel Nature and Parks Authority, and the largest one in the Galilee, but also the one that appropriated 20%, or used, let's not say appropriated, because actually it's not an appropriation, and thus they don't deserve compensation for just that designation of that land as a nature reserve, 20% of the land of the Druze, which is a group that is in fact, it's a complicated relationship that maybe we don't want to go into right now, but it's an Arab sect that sees itself, or maybe Israel sees it, as pretty loyalist to the Zionist agenda, and a lot of them do see themselves as Zionists. And so starting there was a really big decision for me, starting in 1948 Israel, because, as I said, a lot of people say, okay, all of what you're saying is maybe relevant to the West Bank. So this is why intentionally I started within Israel of 1948 to show how these techniques are used inside. All right. And then I do get to chapter 2, to the chapter that you identified. And fallow deer is my first animal there. And the story of the fallow deer, how they were identified in Iran just before the revolution, and how they were flown over And then there were just 4 of them, and they turned out to be female, and there was this project of basically kidnapping the fallow deer in the last El Al flight from Tehran, and then they turned out to just be females, so they had to find some males in zoos, and these are stories that I'm pretty familiar with because
But why were they so important? I mean, why was this particular kind of deer so important?
Well, they were here, and they are biblical species as identified by the missionaries, etc., and they are huntable. And so later there were laws that prevent that. But yeah, they were like, they're going to bring back this landscape that we're imagining here. And so if it's bears, there's a lot of really wild stories behind some of this biblical obsession by a lot of secular Zionists, mind you. So yeah, there's this, it's interesting, the relationship of secular Zionists with the Bible. And so they would pin down. So many of those animals are indeed biblical animals. The ones that I write about the reintroduction. So I'm focusing on the fallow deer. I focus on the wild ass, and then the griffin vulture as well. So these 3 animals, huge struggles to bring them back. It was not, with the griffin vulture, they're already here, but they're declining by 95%. And there were only 70 pairs in the region. And so with extreme efforts, they managed to raise the numbers to 220 pairs. And this is, I'm telling you, about taking them into captivity and rearing the eggs and having names for each chick and putting GPS devices on each one of them and following them and having this ambulance that immediately goes to the scene. We'd be happy if the ambulance reached within 3 minutes to a place where there's algorithms how they follow them. If they're moving in the wrong way, then there's an alert on a cell phone of a ranger that shoots out there and goes and tries to rescue them from possibly eating, some poisonous carcass, inadvertently poisoning the vultures. So this is a massive investment. And yeah, you wonder, that's exactly the question. Why? Why such an investment? And my answer is, it's incredible, but it is a really important project for the Zionist national imaginary. And the way that some of the ornithologists described it is like, if we want to send people to die for the nation, they need to. They're not going to die for some piece of land. They're going to die for the griffin vulture flying above it, for the love of the fallow deer, for the love. That in order to die for a woman, you have to be in love with her, one of the ornithologists told me. So there's those really interesting connections, right?
So I want to ask you on this, to what extent all these practices that you're now describing are common to similar settler colonial societies, be it South Africa, where there's plenty of nature reserves, the United States, and to what extent are they very local and homegrown and very unique to the Israeli Zionist model?
Yeah, great questions. So a lot of these colonial elements do have shared aspects. So there is manifest destiny in the U.S., colonial kind of thought. And in South Africa, well, I just spent quite a few months there, and it was very interesting. I did work with their own parks officials, and so it was interesting to see how they perceive it and the connection between nature protection and the post-apartheid, how they call it, the post-apartheid state. I feel like a lot of these aspects are shared in common. This romanticization that I didn't speak about actually until now, this romanticization of wilderness is really strong in conservation thought throughout. And so it's not unique to the Zionist project, to Israeli conservationists, and in fact, it's given as sometimes even an argument in court why the camel should not be allowed to go and drink water in a nature reserve, but the wild ass has the right to water, or I don't know if it's framed in the language of rights, but this distinction between the wild ass, a wild animal, and the camel, a domesticated species, and why nature protectionists, their loyalty is to the wild ass and not to the camel. The camel should not necessarily drink and eat from the state, from the public resources. The camel has her own owner, and so that owner should provide her with food and drinks. So this idea that animals can be divided between wild and domesticated is already very much part of this kind of conservation thought that is connected to colonial ideas of separation between nature and humans. So if we go back, this idea that wilderness is something that is devoid of humans. But it wasn't devoid of humans. You had to devoid it. The wilderness had to be made. It was not found as wilderness. And this is an idea that historians have pointed out to in the American context, that Yosemite needed to be made as such. Indigenous people had to be eliminated, to put it starkly, right? And so yes, those aspects are shared across the board. However, I think the interesting aspect are in the details, are in the nuances here, with the stories about the biblical animals, with the strength of the military here in Palestine, Israel, and
but also I think that this is the force of your argument and your methodology. Doing an ethnography of the contemporary discourse. I mean, because we can go back to talk about like the historical model and how the settler colonial state in the United States came about 200 years ago there, and I don't know 70, 80, 90 years ago here. But more specifically, are nature conservationists in America or South Africa as obsessed with vultures as the Israelis are?
They're pretty obsessed. Vultures actually, strangely enough, they're in decline in this region, but they're actually a species of least concern according to the International Union of Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, the Red List. So there are disparities between which species are protected where, and so of course that's a really specific political geography. Some of them are endangered across everywhere, but that specifically. So I just
but the question is whether conservationists are as obsessed.
Conservationists, you can't just
No, but as you said earlier, they feel that they're part of a bigger project.
They do
here in Israel. And my question is whether this is something that is still observable in other settler colonial societies that you know.
Yeah. Well, I feel like definitely the Israeli conservationists that I've worked with are very passionate about it, and they are sometimes leading. So you'll see them in treaties, international treaty committees, and but no, I mean, conservationists are passionate elsewhere. I've worked with conservationists, and I did for 15 years a project on coral conservationists. So, people who this is their entire life. The decline of corals, the bleaching, are devastated with climate change. And so I feel like, nature protectionists can be very passionate about their work. In Israel, they do have an element, and I do think that the military aspect is not coincidental, what I said before. A lot of them do come from the military, use military strategies, and I feel like maybe you see that somewhat in other places, but perhaps not as strongly. So a lot of elements can perhaps be seen as enhanced. For example, ecological exceptionalism, this idea that we do this so much better. Like, we're surrounded by people who don't know how to do conservation. Like, sometimes it was even said bluntly, the Palestinians, we have to teach them. They just love to shoot birds. That's their thing. So sometimes you would hear things and you'd be like, whoa, that's like, these could be people who are against the occupation, but when it comes to bird loving and like being really upset about why would they just shoot the animals? And sometimes they would say things like that. And so I don't know that I've heard that when I was working with conservationists saying in the U.S., about a group. So there is that kind of, maybe I will even call it racism, just to kind of be provocative for a second, because I feel like that's maybe something that is important to put on the table. Maybe something that I haven't discussed enough in the book is the connection between colonialism and racism that we can see kind of emerging here. But yeah, so there are unique elements. There are elements that are enhanced in Israeli conservation because it is, and there are elements that I guess are shared across the board. Yeah.
So what about activism, environmental activism, climate activism, the protection of the non-human? How does the colonial structure affect the relationship of human and non-human? And can one protect the non-human outside of this relationship of colonial domination? So say you are here in Israel-Palestine and you are passionate about conservation and about environment and about climate change.
Can you do that
Is there a way to do that without participating in the settlement project?
Well, I believe that there is a way to move conservation beyond colonialism. If I didn't believe that, I probably would not be writing the book. That's my strong motivation. And believe it or not, I feel like maybe if the conservationists are able to read through the book, it could perhaps make some sort of change. Maybe not initially, but that was my hope, right? That I'm trying to also make changes on that level because what I highlight in the book, it is a very strong critique, but it's coming out of love and not out of just tossing the baby with the water. It's like I feel very strongly about conservation initiatives, and I come from an environmental movement. That's kind of my upbringing, and so, yes, I believe that there is a conservation that can move beyond colonialism. Specifically in Israel, you're asking, so can we do? So, I mean, that goes also into structures and organizations and what are their historical legacies. And a lot of those, I really do feel like need to be exposed first, need to be more transparent, need to be more on the surface in order to be able to move beyond it. And you've asked me before, and I didn't answer about like, okay, do you talk about unsettling? Do you talk about the move away? And there are, I started to say, hints in the book. For example, when I'm interviewing the director of the Nature Museum in Palestine, in Bethlehem, and there are a few raptors that were poisoned and they were on their way to Bethlehem for him to try and save them because he's not a vet, he doesn't know how to. And basically that whole, I'll let the listeners perhaps, this is my invitation for you guys to go and read it, because I think that's one of those stories that actually reveal so much, because I'm there and I'm realizing that this person has never done surgery on birds, and he's going to call his brother in the U.S. who is a human doctor to get instructions on how to empty the birds' bellies out with like a syringe. And I'm just like, oh my God, I was just this morning at the Biblical Zoo in Jerusalem, which is about 1 kilometer away, beyond many checkpoints. And why can't we consult with the vet there? And like, if that bird would go there, those 3 birds would have some, they might actually survive.
But because it's a Palestinian bird, then.
Because it happened to land near Nablus rather than fly 30 seconds further and get to some settlement and land there. You see, borders mean so much, even when we're talking about birds that fly beyond borders, right? And so those aspects become really interesting. So they happen to land there. And so now they have to be moved on the land with the Palestinians who have to stop at every checkpoint. And it took them 8 hours instead of those 3 minutes that it would have taken them by air. And so one of them didn't survive on the way, and then the other died during the surgery. But what was really interesting is that initially the director wasn't willing to collaborate or cooperate with the vet in Jerusalem. And he said, no, this is normal. This is exactly normalization. So the Palestinian zoologist wasn't willing to with the Jewish vet in the biblical zoo. And well, to make this story a little shorter, I think the intricacies are really interesting, but bottom line is that I, at the end, served as the translator between them. Like, basically, I was the bridge, and we were able to he was able to operate on the Palestinian bird under his own terms, on his own, in Palestine, Area A, and then he was able to release it. And it was a Palestinian project. And it was under his terms. And he consulted under his own terms. And, and I felt like, so that was an important moment for him. What do we make of it? How this moment maybe can unsettle some of the premises of ecological exceptionalism. We do it better. We should do this, or like you should do it this way or that way. Those are some of the questions that I guess will be for the next project. But those are the hints. Those are the seeds that I plant in this specific book. Yeah.
All right, Professor Iris Braverman, thank you very much for coming on the show today. You are the author of the new book, Settling Nature, the Conservation Regime in Palestine and Israel. And our listeners can purchase the book with a 40% discount by going to the University of Minnesota Press website and entering a code that will be available to you in the show notes, whether on your app or on our website. Thank you very much, Iris.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studio. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Yael on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.
Goodbye.